August 20th, 1945. Opera Harbor, Guam. The transport ship's engines rumbled to life as nearly 300 Japanese women stepped onto the gangway. Their khaki uniforms faded and worn, their faces hollow with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. These were nurses who had held dying men in their arms, radio operators who had transmitted the Empire's final desperate orders, students barely 18 years old conscripted into a war machine that promised them glory and delivered only ash. They moved in silence, surrounded by American guards, men whose very existence contradicted everything these women had been taught, men who should not be standing there at all, tall and strong and healthy because the propaganda had promised that America was dying. But here they stood, shoulders broad, moving with casual strength that seemed almost theatrical in its ease. One nurse, a young woman of 22 named Reiko Nakamura from Hiroshima, stared at these men and felt something crack inside her chest. Not fear, something worse, the beginning of doubt. She would later write in her journal a single line that captured the growing terror in her heart, a terror that had nothing to do with captivity and everything to do with truth. If everything they told us about their weakness was a lie, what else did they hide from us? The realization had not fully formed yet. But as the ship pulled away from Guam's devastated shores, heading east toward the mainland, 300 women began a 10-day journey that would demolish the manufactured reality they had lived inside for years. They thought they were traveling to imprisonment. They did not know they were sailing toward truth itself. Before we continue this journey, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Whether you are in New York, Texas, or somewhere between, this story deserves to be heard. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about enemies, about truth, and about the power of a single meal to destroy an empire's lies. This is the story of the shattered truth, and it begins with hunger, the world they knew to understand the shock that awaited them. You need to understand the world they had been raised in, a world constructed with the precision of a military operation and the cruelty of a lie told so often it becomes reality. Since the 1930s, Japanese citizens had been fed a carefully constructed narrative through every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lecture. It was not just propaganda. It was a complete reconstruction of reality itself. America was portrayed as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing and capitalist decadence. Its people were lazy, its men soft from luxury, its women vulgar. The empire's propagandists painted a picture of American cities, crumbling factories, silent breadlines stretching for miles. These were not random lies. They were calculated psychological weapons designed to make sacrifice acceptable. If your enemy was already dying, your own starvation made sense. If their soldiers were inferior, your brother's death had meaning. If their nation was collapsing, your suffering was temporary. The Ministry of Information controlled every image, every statistic, every whisper that reached the public. By 1945, most Japanese civilians genuinely believed America was on the verge of collapse. The women on that transport ship carried this manufactured worldview in their bones. Reiko Nakamura, 22 years old, had spent 3 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. She had watched boys her age die whispering bonsai, believing their sacrifice would save the homeland. She had gone weeks eating nothing but watery rice gruel and dried fish, told that American soldiers were starving even worse. When her commanding officer surrendered in August, Reiko assumed they would be executed. That was what happened to prisoners. Everyone knew the Americans were barbaric that way. Sitting beside her on the ship was Michiko Sato, 24 years old, a mathematics expert who had worked as a radio operator. For 18 months, Michiko had read false victory reports over the airwaves. She had known they were lies. Every operator knew, but she had believed the core narrative. America was stretched thin, struggling, rationing everything. That was why the lies were necessary to keep morale up during the final push toward victory. And there was Ayumi Ishikawa, just 18 years old, a university student pulled from her classroom at 17 to serve in administrative support. Her father had died of starvation after giving his daughter his final bowl of rice. Ayumi believed he had died for something, that his sacrifice meant the empire would triumph over a weak and dying enemy. 3 women, 3 stories, 3 versions of the same foundational lie. But the first crack in that lie came before the ship even left harbor. The first crack, an American medic approached the assembled prisoners for infectious disease screening. She was a woman with golden hair pulled back in a crisp white uniform that looked impossibly clean. She worked quickly and efficiently, but without cruelty. When Reiko flinched during the examination, the medic smiled and said something in English. An interpreter translated, "You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Reiko did not believe it, could not believe it. Kindness from the enemy was just another form of torture, surely. A way to lower their guard before the real horror began. But when the examination ended and the medic offered her a piece of candy, real sugar wrapped in bright paper, something shifted. The woman's hands were steady, her nails clean, her skin healthy, not the hands of someone whose nation was starving. Reiko took the candy. She held it for a long time before unwrapping it. The sweetness, when it finally touched her tongue, was almost painful after years of deprivation. Around her, other women received similar, small kindnesses. A drink of clean water, a blanket when someone shivered. Words spoken in gentle tones even when the prisoners could not understand them. These were tiny gestures, insignificant in isolation. But together they formed a pattern that contradicted everything the women had been told to expect. The ship departed at dawn. For the first few hours, the women sat in silence in the cargo hold converted into temporary quarters with bunks and blankets. They expected deprivation. They expected punishment. What they got was lunch, the meal that broke the world. American sailors carried in metal trays loaded with food. The smell hit the women first, rich and complex and overwhelming after years of near starvation. White bread, soft and fresh, canned peaches swimming in heavy syrup, beef stew with actual chunks of meat visible in the gravy, not the water and bone broth they had survived on. Butter in individual portions, coffee that smelled rich and dark, and portions. God, the portions. More food on a single tray than most of them had seen in a week back home. At first, no one ate. They stared at the trays like they might be poisoned. 300 women frozen between hunger and fear. Then one woman, a former radio operator, picked up a piece of bread. She tore it slowly, examining the texture, sniffing it. White bread, pure white flour with no sawdust, no bark, no rice husks mixed in to stretch the supply. She took a bite. Her eyes widened. She took another bite, then another, eating faster, now tears streaming down her face. That broke the dam. 300 women fell on the food like starving wolves because that was what they were. Malnourished to the point where their bodies had begun consuming themselves. And as they ate, as the sugar hit their bloodstreams and the protein began rebuilding their wasted muscles, a terrible question formed in 300 minds simultaneously. If they have this much food to give prisoners, how much do they have for themselves? Reiko ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to savor each bite. She had been a nurse. She understood nutrition. She knew what her body needed. But she also knew what this meal meant. This was not prisoner rations. This was better than what Japanese soldiers received. Better than what civilians back home could dream of obtaining. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Her mind kept trying to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been told. There had to be an explanation. Maybe this was a special meal, a temporary excess, before the real deprivation began. Maybe it was meant to fatten them up for some darker purpose. But then the meals continued, 3 times a day, every day, for 10 days. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs with toast and jam. Lunch varied between sandwiches thick with meat and cheese or soups so rich they seemed obscene. Dinner always included protein, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dessert. There was always dessert. Cookies, cake pudding, fruit cocktail, and syrup so sweet it hurt. On the 3rd day, Reiko watched an American sailor scrape half-eaten food off his plate into a garbage bin. She felt something break inside her chest. That discarded food casually thrown away would have fed her entire family for 2 days. She remembered her mother's hands perpetually shaking from malnutrition. Her little brother Kenji, 8 years old, whose growth had stunted from chronic hunger. Her father, a factory worker, who had given his rice portions to his children until he became too weak to work. And here the enemy threw food into the sea like it meant nothing. The whispers begin. Night brought whispered conversations in the hold, hesitant at first, then growing bolder as the darkness gave them courage. Did you see the guards' boots? Brand new leather. When did you last see new leather boots? The blankets they gave us are wool. Real wool, not that recycled garbage we got at the end. How do they have so much wool? The medic had actual medicine, morphine sulfa drugs, not the watered-down military-issue garbage that barely worked. Ayumi, the youngest, said what many were thinking but afraid to voice. Everything was a lie. An older woman, a former teacher named Tomoko Fujimoto, 35 years old, hissed back, "Shut your mouth. You will get us all punished. This is psychological warfare. They are trying to break us." But the seed was planted. And with every meal, every glimpse of casual American abundance, it grew. Michiko, the radio operator, who had spent 18 months broadcasting lies, sat in her bunk calculating. She was a mathematics student before the war, recruited for her technical skills. She knew numbers. She understood logistics. She thought about the food they were eating. 3 meals a day for 300 prisoners, multiplied across however many prisoner of war camps America operated. Add the soldiers fighting overseas, the civilians back home. The sheer volume of production required to feed everyone well, not just adequately, but well, was staggering. Japan could not feed its own soldiers properly, could not feed its civilians at all by the end. And yet America was throwing food away. The mathematics did not just suggest defeat. They suggested impossibility. They suggested Japan had never had a chance. Michiko kept these calculations to herself, but they haunted her through the long nights as the ship plowed eastward across the Pacific. San Francisco. On day 7, the California coast appeared through morning fog. The women were allowed on deck in shifts to exercise and breathe fresh air. Reiko stood at the railing, gripping the cold metal, watching the shoreline materialize. Then San Francisco emerged from the mist, and the world ended. Skyscrapers, dozens of them, steel and glass towers stabbing upward into the clouds, taller than anything Reiko had ever seen. The Golden Gate Bridge, impossibly massive, painted bright orange, carrying what looked like hundreds of vehicles across the bay. Docks swarming with activity. Cranes loading and unloading ships in organized chaos. Warehouses the size of city blocks. And beyond the waterfront, the city itself. Buildings stacked on hills. Streets grid straight. Lights winking on as evening approached. This was a dying nation. This was defeat. Ayumi stood beside Reiko, gripping the railing so hard her knuckles went white. She whispered as if speaking too loudly might make it all vanish. It is not real. It has to be a stage set. But stage sets do not smell like diesel and salt air. Stage sets do not hum with electrical power. Stage sets do not stretch to the horizon in every direction, solid and real and utterly devastatingly intact. A sailor walked past, whistling, hands in his pockets. Just another day in San Francisco. He glanced at the Japanese women, nodded politely, kept walking. To him, this was normal. The city, the abundance, the power, all of it was just Tuesday. Reiko turned away from the railing. She could not look anymore. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, like a headache that started behind her eyes and spread through her entire skull. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, everything she had sacrificed for, it was collapsing like paper in fire. If America looked like this now after 4 years of total war, what had it looked like before? And more terrifying, if this was their coastal city, what did their industrial heartland look like? The question hung in the air like smoke, and the answer would come soon enough, whether they wanted it or not. The train inland. The women were transferred to a passenger train, a real passenger train with cushioned seats and windows and a dining car. Not a cattle car, not a prison transport, a train that looked like it carried regular passengers on regular journeys. For 3 days, they watched America scroll past the windows like a propaganda film in reverse. Every mile, every hour, every glimpse out the window destroyed another piece of the reality they had been raised to believe. Farmland, endless, impossibly vast farmland. Wheat fields golden in autumn sun, stretching to horizons that seemed to curve with the earth itself. Orchards, heavy with fruit trees, planted in perfect rows, hundreds of acres tended by machines they had never seen before. Cattle grazing in pastures so large, the herds looked like distant dots. Grain silos tall as buildings filled with a surplus the nation could not even consume. Reiko had grown up in a farming village outside Osaka. She knew agriculture, knew the back-breaking labor of rice cultivation, knew how weather and pests and poor soil could destroy a harvest and doom a family. What she was seeing through this train window was not farming, it was something else. Industrial, mechanized, abundant beyond reason. At one stop, a small town in Nebraska with a population maybe 2,000 children played on the platform while the train took on water. American children. The women watched them through the windows. The children were tall, healthy, their clothes clean, their cheeks full, their teeth straight and white. They laughed and chased each other with the unthinking energy of the well-fed. Reiko thought of her brother Kenji, 8 years old and barely 4 feet tall, his growth permanently stunted by malnutrition. These American children, some younger than him, stood taller, weighed more, moved with a strength he would never have. The comparison was not just humbling, it was annihilating. One girl, maybe 10 years old, stood on the platform eating an apple. She took 3 bites, decided she did not want it anymore, and tossed it into a trash bin. 3 bites, then garbage. Reiko watched that apple disappear and felt something fundamental break inside her understanding of the world. This was not just abundance. This was waste. Casual, careless waste born from such profound plenty that food had no value. The numbers. On the third day, the train passed through Gary, Indiana. Steel mills lined the horizon, smokestacks breathing fire into the dusk. Blast furnaces glowing orange against the darkening sky. An interpreter explained, the mills run 24 hours, 3 shifts. They ran that way throughout the war, producing steel for ships and tanks and aircraft. Michiko stared at those mills and did calculations in her head. She had been a mathematics student before the war, recruited into radio operations because of her technical skills. She knew numbers. And the numbers she was calculating now did not just spell defeat, they spelled impossibility. She turned to Reiko and Ayumi, her voice barely above a whisper. Japan never had a chance. Not against this. Not against a nation that could field armies and feed them well and run steel mills around the clock and still have enough left over to throw food away and let children waste apples. Ayumi started to cry quietly, not from fear, from the weight of understanding. Her father had died giving her his last bowl of rice, believing his sacrifice had meaning, believing Japan would triumph over a weakened enemy. But the enemy had never been weak. That was the lie, the foundational lie upon which all the other lies were built. Reiko put her arm around Ayumi, but said nothing. What could she say? What words existed to comfort someone whose father died for a lie? That night, whispered conversations spread through the train car. Someone had found a discarded San Francisco newspaper. They passed it around those who could read English, translating for those who could not. The stories were mundane. Labor strikes over wages, debates about housing, advertisements for new cars and refrigerators. The ordinary concerns of a nation at peace, or nearly so. No mention of starvation. No mention of collapse. No mention of the dying empire that propaganda had promised them. One story mentioned surplus food being shipped to Europe to feed refugees. Surplus food. America had so much food they were giving it away to strangers across the ocean. Reiko read that story 3 times, trying to make it make sense, trying to reconcile it with the world she thought she knew. But the reconciliation was impossible. The world she thought she knew had never existed. They were not being shown America. They were seeing America, the real America. And the difference between those two things was the difference between their entire worldview and the truth, the confrontation. On that third night, as the train rolled through the darkness toward Wisconsin, the tension that had been building finally broke. Tomoko Fujimoto, the former teacher who had tried to maintain order and discipline among the prisoners, stood up in the dining car where many women had gathered. Her face was flushed. Her hands shook. Her voice was sharp, almost desperate. You are all being fooled. This is propaganda. They are showing us their best while hiding their worst. They want us to believe they are strong, so we will be docile prisoners. Do not fall for it. But her words rang hollow now. Too much had been seen. Too much had been experienced. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Ayumi stood up, her young face streaked with tears. My father died believing America was weak. He gave me his food. He starved so I could eat. He died thinking his sacrifice mattered, that Japan would win. She turned to face Tomoko directly. But we were never going to win, were we? They lied to us. They lied to my father, and he died for that lie. Tomoko opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she say? She was a teacher. She had taught children to love the empire. She had read them the propaganda. She had helped build the lie. Reiko stood up slowly. She had been a nurse. She had watched soldiers die in her arms, boys barely old enough to shave whispering bonsai with their last breaths. She had told them they were dying for something noble, something meaningful. She spoke quietly, but everyone heard her. I held a boy named Kenji as he died. 16 years old. Infection. No antibiotics. He asked me if the Americans were starving worse than us. I told him yes. I told him his death meant something because the enemy was dying too. Her voice broke slightly. But they were not dying. They were throwing food away. And Kenji died for nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels seemed muted. Michiko finally spoke her mathematician's mind, cutting through the emotion to the brutal logic underneath. I calculated it. I have been calculating since we left Guam. The industrial capacity, the agricultural output, the shipping tonnage, the steel production. She paused, then continued with the flat certainty of numbers. Japan produced 28,000 aircraft during the war. America produced 96,000. We built 540 warships. They built 2,600. For every barrel of oil we refined, they refined 54. She looked around at the assembled women. We lost this war before it started. Our leaders knew it. They had the same numbers I have, and they sent us to die anyway. Tomoko sat down heavily, her face gray. She had no answer. There was no answer. Arrival in Wisconsin, the train pulled into Camp McCoy, Wisconsin on a cold autumn morning. Leaves blazed red and gold in the surrounding forests. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The women descended from the train stiff and exhausted from 3 days of travel and the emotional weight of revelation. They expected prison, barbed wire guard towers, concrete cells. Instead, they found wooden barracks with heating stoves, communal showers with hot running water, a mess hall that smelled of cooking food, and a recreation yard with real grass. An American officer addressed them through an interpreter. Welcome to Camp McCoy. You are prisoners of war and will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. You will be housed, fed, and provided medical care. You will be assigned work details appropriate to your skills. You will not be mistreated. Reiko barely heard the words. She was staring at the camp itself. This was not what a prison looked like. This looked like a military base. Organized, clean, functional. There were guards, yes, but they were not cruel or threatening. They looked bored, if anything. The first night in the barracks with real beds and clean sheets and blankets that smelled of soap, Reiko lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of 300 women trying to process what had happened to them. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stared at the ceiling in silence. Michiko in the bunk next to Reiko whispered into the darkness. I keep thinking about the radio broadcasts, all those victory reports I read, all those lies I told. People believed me. People made decisions based on what I said. People died believing those lies. Reiko had no comfort to offer. She was carrying her own weight of guilt and revelation. Ayumi, young and devastated, spoke from across the aisle. What do we do now? How do we live knowing everything we believed was a lie? That was the question. The terrible, inescapable question. Not how do we survive imprisonment. That was almost easy by comparison. The real question was, how do you rebuild yourself when the entire foundation of your identity has been revealed as fiction? Reiko did not have an answer. Not yet. But as she lay there in the darkness of that first night, listening to the quiet sounds of 300 souls in crisis, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. They were not prisoners of the Americans. They were prisoners of the truth. And the truth was far more devastating than any physical captivity could ever be. The journey was not over. It was only beginning. Because discovering you have been lied to is just the first step. The harder part comes next, living with that knowledge, deciding what to do with it, figuring out who you are when everything you thought you knew turns out to be false. And the hardest moments were still ahead. Because knowledge without understanding is just pain. And understanding, when it finally comes, requires something even more difficult than accepting the truth. It requires forgiveness. Of others, yes. But most difficult of all, forgiveness of yourself. That lesson would come. But not yet. First, there would be more revelations, more shocks, more moments when the carefully constructed lies of propaganda would shatter against the messy, complicated, sometimes cruel, but ultimately human reality of their former enemy. Subscribe now because what happens next will challenge everything about enemies, about mercy, and about the strange and terrible power of kindness to break what cruelty never could. The story of the women of Camp McCoy has only just begun, and the truth they are about to discover will change not just their lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren for generations to come. This is the story of shattered certainties, of manufactured realities colliding with undeniable truth, of 300 women who went to war believing in an empire and came home believing in something else entirely. And it all started with a meal on a ship, with too much food given to people who expected none, with the simple, devastating realization that everything you were told about your enemy was a lie. What else did they lie about? That question would echo through the rest of their lives. But the answer when it came would be both more terrible and more hopeful than they could imagine. The first step on that journey was complete. They had left behind the world of lies. Now they had to learn to live in the world of truth. And that it would turn out was the hardest journey of all, the weight of clean water. The first shower broke dozens of them. Hot water, endless and clean. Steam rising in clouds that filled the communal bathroom like morning fog over rice paddies. The smell of real soap, not the ash and lye mixture they had used in Japan when they could get anything at all. Reiko stood beneath the spray for 20 minutes, letting the heat soak into muscles that had been tense for years. The water ran brown at first, carrying away layers of dirt and exhaustion. Then it ran clear. And still she stood there, unable to move, unable to process the simple luxury of being truly clean. Around her, other women wept openly, not from sadness, from the overwhelming shock of kindness, of a basic human dignity they had been denied so long they had forgotten it existed. When had she last been truly clean? Reiko tried to remember and could not. In Japan, soap had vanished years ago. Civilians washed with ash and cold water and prayers. Bathing was a quick, miserable affair, scrubbing just enough to remove the worst of the filth before the cold drove you out. Here the water stayed hot. The soap came in bars, thick and white, that smelled of flowers. An American nurse handed them out freely, one per woman, as if they cost nothing. Because to America they did not. The same factories that built bombers could drown the world in soap. The contrast was unbearable. Michiko stood at the sink, staring at her reflection in a mirror that was not cracked or dirty. She barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than she remembered. Her eyes looked older, but her skin was clean. Actually clean, for the first time in years. She turned to Reiko, her voice barely above a whisper. They give this to prisoners. Hot water and soap and mirrors. What do they give their own people? The question hung in the steamy air unanswered, but both women knew. If this was how America treated its enemies, how must it treat its citizens? That night, back in the barracks with their hair still damp and smelling of soap, the whispered conversations took on a new tone, less fearful, more confused. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Ayumi sat on her bunk, running her fingers through her clean hair. She spoke to no one in particular, but everyone heard. My mother used to save water from washing vegetables to wash our faces. We would use the same water for 3 days. And here they let it run down the drain like it means nothing. An older woman, a former factory worker named Sumiko, shook her head slowly. It is not that it means nothing. It is that they have so much it does not need to mean anything. Do you understand the difference? Ayumi did not answer. None of them did, because understanding that difference required accepting something too large to fit inside their minds all at once. It required accepting that Japan had been fighting not just a stronger enemy, but an enemy operating on a completely different scale of existence. The medical examination. The medical examinations began on the second day. Army doctors, men and women in clean white coats, set up in the camp's medical building. Each woman would be checked for disease, malnutrition, injuries that needed treatment. The women lined up outside in the weak autumn sunlight. The fear was back, cold and familiar. Medical examination was what the Nazi doctors had called it, too. They had heard. Before the experiments. Before the horrors. But an older woman in the line, a former nurse named Keiko, spoke up. I know military medicine. I worked in field hospitals. If they wanted to hurt us, they would not bother with examinations. They would just do it. Her words offered small comfort. Logic could say one thing. Instinct, trained by years of war and propaganda, said another. Reiko was called in early. She entered the medical building with her heart hammering in her chest, trying to keep her face neutral and her hands from shaking. Inside, 3 doctors waited, 2 men and 1 woman. The woman was American but clearly of Asian descent, which surprised Reiko. She had assumed all Americans were white, the way propaganda portrayed them. The lead doctor was an older man, perhaps 50, with gray hair and eyes that looked tired but not unkind. He spoke through an interpreter, a young Japanese-American corporal, who translated with a neutral professional tone. We are going to examine you for signs of disease or malnutrition. We will check your heart, lungs, throat, and general physical condition. We will take your temperature and blood pressure. This will not hurt. Do you understand? Reiko nodded, not trusting her voice. The examination was thorough but not rough. The doctor listened to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope, looked in her throat and ears with small lights, pressed gently on her abdomen, checking for swelling or tenderness, took her temperature with a thermometer that had been sterilized in alcohol. Throughout it all, his face remained professionally neutral. But Reiko, who had been a nurse, recognized the small changes in his expression. The slight tightening around his eyes when he listened to her lungs, the way his mouth pressed into a thin line when he felt her ribs through her thin dress. Finally, he stepped back and spoke to his colleagues in English. They exchanged words that Reiko could not understand, but their tone was serious, concerned. The doctor turned to her and the interpreter translated. You have fluid in your lungs. Early stages, but it needs treatment or it will become pneumonia. You are also severely malnourished. Your body weight is approximately 30% below what it should be for your height and age. Your blood pressure is low. Do you experience dizziness or fatigue? Reiko nodded slowly. She had been dizzy and tired for months. Everyone was dizzy and tired. That was just how life was. You pushed through it. You did not complain. You certainly did not expect anyone to care. The doctor continued. We are going to treat you. You will receive antibiotics for the lung infection, vitamin supplements for the malnutrition, iron tablets for anemia. You will need to return here every day for 1 week so we can monitor your progress. The female doctor opened a cabinet. Inside were rows of medicine bottles, all organized and labeled. She counted pills into a small paper envelope with practiced efficiency. She handed it to Reiko with instructions delivered through the interpreter. 1 pill 3 times a day, after each meal. Do not skip doses. The infection will get worse if you stop treatment early. Do you understand? Reiko took the envelope. Her hands shook, but not from fear anymore. From shock. Real medicine. Antibiotics. The kind of medicine that had become rarer than gold in Japan by the war's end. Soldiers died from infections that a few pills could have cured. Children died from diseases that medicine could have prevented. And here the enemy was giving it to her. A prisoner. A Japanese woman who had been part of the machine that tried to destroy them. The doctor seemed to notice her shock. He said something in English and the interpreter hesitated before translating. He says he lost his son in the Pacific. But medicine is not about revenge. It is about healing. And you need healing. Reiko's eyes began to burn. She tried to stop the tears. She had learned to shut down her emotions during the war. She had watched people die without crying. She had amputated limbs without flinching. But this was different. This was kindness from someone who had every reason to hate her. And kindness, after so many years of brutality, broke something inside her that brutality never could. She walked out of the medical building in a daze, clutching the envelope of pills like a lifeline or an accusation. She was not sure which. The breaking of Tomoko Fujimoto, the former teacher who had tried to maintain discipline and belief, was one of the last to be examined. She had held out longest against accepting what was happening. She insisted it was all theater, a calculated display designed to break their spirit. When she emerged from the medical building 2 hours later, she was not the same woman who went in. She walked slowly to where Reiko, Michiko, and Ayumi sat on a bench outside the barracks. Her face was gray. Her hands trembled. She held a bottle of pills and a paper with instructions written in both English and Japanese. She sat down heavily beside them and stared at the ground for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. The doctor. He was old, maybe 55. He examined me. He found tumors in my breast. He said they are cancer, that I need surgery, that without it, I will die within a year. The other women sat frozen, unsure what to say. Tomoko continued, her voice hollow. He said they will operate, that they have a surgeon who can remove the tumors, that they will give me anesthesia so I will not feel pain, that after surgery I will receive radiation treatment to kill any remaining cancer cells. She looked up at them, her eyes wet. He said all of this. He wrote it all down. He scheduled the surgery for next week. He gave me pills for the pain. He told me not to worry, that they have treated many cases like mine successfully. Her voice broke. He is going to save my life. The enemy, the Americans, they are going to save my life when my own country would have just let me die. She began to cry, not quiet, dignified tears, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere fundamental. The sound of something breaking that had been under pressure too long. Reiko put her arm around the older woman's shoulders. Michiko took her hand. Ayumi knelt in front of her, offering a handkerchief. They sat that way for a long time, 4 women in enemy territory, mourning not for what had been done to them, but for what had been revealed to them. The truth was more painful than any torture could have been. The numbers revealed, 1 week into their stay at Camp McCoy, a U.S. Army officer gave a presentation in the camp's assembly hall. It was not mandatory, the interpreter explained, but the women were encouraged to attend. It would help them understand the war, understand what had happened, understand why. Nearly all 300 women came. Curiosity, perhaps, or the need to finally hear the truth spoken plainly instead of whispered in the dark. The officer was a lieutenant colonel, perhaps 40 years old, with the bearing of a career military man. He set up a blackboard and began writing numbers. Through the interpreter, he spoke in a tone that was neither triumphant nor condemning, simply factual. Aircraft production, United States 96,000, Japan 28,000. Naval vessels, United States 2,600, Japan 540. Oil production, United States 1.8 billion barrels, Japan 33 million barrels, a ratio of 54-1. Steel production, aluminum production, rubber production, food production. In every category, the disparity was enormous and undeniable. He drew graphs showing the industrial capacity of both nations. The lines were not even close. America's production line climbed steeply upward throughout the war. Japan's production line grew slightly, then collapsed after 1943. The women sat in absolute silence. Michiko stared at the numbers with the expression of someone seeing her worst fears confirmed. She had calculated these numbers herself, but seeing them written, officially acknowledged, openly, made them undeniable. The officer continued, "Your leaders knew these numbers. They had intelligence. They had reports. They knew the industrial capacity disparity before the war began. They chose to proceed anyway." He paused to let the interpreter finish, then added, "The question many of you are probably asking is why? Why did they send you to fight a war they knew could not be won?" The room was so quiet you could hear breathing. The officer did not answer his own question. He simply said, "That is something you will need to ask them. Not me. I cannot tell you why your leaders made the choices they made. I can only show you the mathematics of those choices." He erased the blackboard and wrote new numbers. Casualties. Japanese military dead estimated at 2.3 million. Japanese civilian dead estimated between 500,000 and 1 million most in the final year of the war. The war ended in August 1945, but these numbers suggest it was effectively lost by early 1943. Everything after that was delay and death. Michiko stood up suddenly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head turned to look at her. Her voice shook but remained clear. "I was a radio operator. I broadcast victory reports. I told the people we were winning. I told them America was collapsing. I told them just a little more sacrifice and victory would be ours." She paused, gathering herself. "I knew some of those reports were exaggerated, but I believed the core was true, that we had a chance, that the sacrifice meant something." Her voice grew louder. "But you are saying my leaders knew. After 1943, they knew. And they kept fighting, kept sending people to D. My brother was killed in 1944. 14 months after the war was already lost." She turned to look at the assembled women. Everyone in this room lost someone. Family, friends, comrades. They died believing their sacrifice had meaning. That victory was possible. She turned back to the officer. But it was never possible, was it? After 1943, every death was murder. Murder by our own leaders. The officer did not argue. He simply said, "That is one way to interpret the data, yes." The photograph. The days settled into a routine. Work details in the morning, classes in the afternoon, free time in the evening. The work was not difficult. Laundry, kitchen duty, groundskeeping, things that kept the camp running. Reiko was assigned to work in the medical building assisting the nurses. Her training made her valuable, and the American medical staff welcomed her help with a professionalism that surprised her. She worked alongside Dr. Crawford, the older doctor who had first examined her. He was a quiet man dedicated to his work, patient with her limited English. He taught her about American medical procedures, about the new drugs and techniques that had been developed during the war. One afternoon, while organizing medical files, a photograph fell from Dr. Crawford's coat pocket. Reiko bent to pick it up, intending to return it immediately. But the image stopped her cold. Two young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. One wore American Army green. The other wore German Wehrmacht gray. Her English was not good, but she could read the handwriting on the back. Michael and Hans, France, 1944. Dr. Crawford noticed her holding the photograph. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and she saw profound grief in his eyes. He took the photo gently from her hands and stared at it for a long moment before speaking in slow, simple English that he knew she could follow. "My son, Michael, he was medic, like you, nurse. He died in France, trying to save wounded German soldier. This soldier, Hans," he pointed to the German soldier in the photograph. "Hans survived. Michael did not. Hans wrote me letter after the war, sent me this photograph, told me Michael died saving his life, that Michael was good man, that he was sorry." Reiko's limited English was enough to understand. Her eyes widened as the implications sank in. Dr. Crawford continued, "I was angry, very angry. My son died for enemy. I did not understand. Why would he do that? Why save enemy?" He tucked the photograph back in his pocket. "But then I think Michael was doctor, healer. He did not see enemy. He saw wounded man, patient, human." He looked directly at Reiko. "So I come here, to camp, to heal enemy, like my son. Because medicine is not about hate. Medicine is about healing all people, even enemy, maybe especially enemy." Reiko felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She understood now. Understood why this man whose son had been killed was treating Japanese prisoners with such care. He was honoring his son's memory, completing his son's work. She bowed deeply in the Japanese way, though she knew he might not understand the gesture. But he did. He nodded slightly in return. That evening, Reiko told the others about the photograph, about Dr. Crawford's son, about why he was here. The story spread through the camp like wildfire. Women who had been suspicious, who had held on to their fear and mistrust, found those defenses crumbling. How do you hate someone who lost their child to your country but still chooses to heal you? Tomoko, the former teacher, sat with her head in her hands. She spoke so quietly they almost could not hear. What kind of people are these? Their sons die fighting us, and they respond with mercy. What does that make us who showed no mercy when we had power? No one had an answer. The questions were too large, too painful, too fundamental to who they thought they were. The letters from home. In late October, letters from Japan began arriving, the first mail the women had received since capture. They were censored, of course, black marks through anything too sensitive. But even redacted, they brought news from a world that seemed increasingly alien. Reiko's letter was from her mother. The handwriting shaky, uncertain, not like her mother's confident script from before the war. The words were simple. The family was alive. They were being fed by American occupation forces. Rice and canned vegetables, and even sometimes meat. More food than they had seen in years. Reiko's brother Kenji had grown 5 centimeters in 2 months. 5 centimeters. After years of stunted growth, adequate nutrition was finally allowing his body to develop. "Your brother asks about you constantly. He wants to know if the Americans are treating you well." I told him I do not know, but I pray they are. The soldiers here are not what we were told to expect. They are helping us rebuild. It is very strange. Very confusing. Nothing is as we thought it would be. Reiko read the letter 3 times, trying to understand the emotion it stirred in her. Not happiness exactly, something more complicated. Her family was alive and being fed. That was good. But they were being fed by the enemy, by the occupiers, the people she had been raised to hate and fear. Except the occupiers were not killing and raping. They were feeding children, making them grow. The contrast between what she had been told and what was actually happening was making her question everything she had ever believed. Michiko received a letter from her mother as well. It was shorter, more cautious, but it contained one line that struck her like a physical blow. The emperor has renounced his divinity. He is just a man now. Everything sacred is dissolving. Michiko sat on her bunk, staring at those words until they blurred. The emperor, the divine descendant of the sun goddess, the living embodiment of Japan itself. Just a man now. An admission that the entire spiritual foundation of the empire had been a fiction. If the emperor was not divine, what had they been dying for? If the imperial cult was a lie, what else was a lie? Where did you even begin to sort truth from fiction when everything you had been taught was suspect? Ayumi's letter was from an aunt. Her parents were both dead, but the aunt wrote that Ayumi's father was being remembered as a hero, that his sacrifice for the empire would never be forgotten. Ayumi crumpled the letter in her fist. Hero. Her father had starved to death because the government failed to feed its people. He died believing the enemy was weaker than they were. He died for a lie. She stood up abruptly and walked to where Reiko and Michiko sat. Her young face was set with a determination that had not been there before. When we go home, she said, when this is over and they send us back, we have to tell the truth. We have to tell everyone what we learned here, about the food, about the medicine, about the doctors who lost sons and still chose to heal us. We have to tell them everything. Reiko and Michiko exchanged glances. Ayumi was right, but telling the truth meant admitting they had been lied to. It meant admitting they had participated in those lies. It meant tearing down the remaining pillars of belief that held their culture together. It meant choosing truth over comfort, and that was the hardest choice of all. The crisis. 3 weeks after the medical examinations, one of the women fell desperately ill. Her name was Yuki, a former factory worker only 20 years old. She had seemed fine during the examination, but tuberculosis was deceptive. It could hide for months before erupting into crisis. Yuki collapsed during a morning work detail, coughing blood, unable to breathe. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Medical staff rushed her to the infirmary. Dr. Crawford worked on her for hours. The other women gathered outside waiting for news. Tomoko, whose cancer surgery had been scheduled for the following week, stood with them. She had grown quieter in recent days, more thoughtful. The approaching surgery had forced her to confront her own mortality and the strange mercy of receiving life-saving treatment from the enemy. Dr. Crawford emerged after 3 hours. His face was exhausted. Through the interpreter, he spoke to the assembled women. She has advanced tuberculosis, both lungs. It is very serious. We are treating her with every medicine we have, but I cannot promise she will survive. The next 24 hours will tell us. He paused, then added something the interpreter seemed reluctant to translate. When prompted, the interpreter said, Dr. Crawford says that Yuki did not receive proper medical care earlier in the war. If she had been treated months ago when symptoms first appeared, she might have been cured easily. He is angry that she was allowed to get this sick without treatment. The women stood in stunned silence. The enemy doctor was angry that an enemy soldier had not received proper medical care from her own side. The reversal was so complete, it was almost incomprehensible. That night, the women took turns sitting vigil outside the infirmary. Not because they were required to, because they needed to. Yuki represented something larger than herself. She was the test case. Would the Americans really fight to save her life? Or was there a limit to their mercy? Reiko sat her shift from midnight to 3 a.m. Through the window, she could see Dr. Crawford still at work, checking Yuki's vital signs, adjusting medications, monitoring her breathing. The man was over 50 years old. He should have been sleeping. Instead, he was fighting to save a 20-year-old Japanese woman who his own son might have fought against. At 2 a.m., Dr. Crawford came out for coffee. He saw Reiko through the window and gestured for her to come in. Her English was still limited, but they communicated through gestures and simple words. He showed her Yuki's chart. explained the treatments they were trying. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime in medicine, but his eyes showed something else: exhaustion, grief, and determination. He said in slow, simple English, "She is someone's daughter, someone's sister, maybe someone's mother. When I look at her, I see my son, young, wanting to live, deserving to live." He paused. War makes enemies, but medicine does not. Medicine sees only patients, only humans who need help. Reiko understood, and in that moment something fundamental shifted inside her. These were not monsters wearing masks of kindness. These were human beings who had chosen mercy over revenge, who had chosen healing over hate. And that choice made them more powerful than any weapon, because it was a choice that could not be defeated by military force. It could only be answered by a choice of equal magnitude, the choice to abandon hate in favor of understanding. Yuki survived. Against the odds, against the severity of her illness, she survived. It took weeks. It took medicine that Japan could no longer produce. It took the dedicated care of doctors and nurses who had no obligation to save her, except the obligation they felt to human life itself. When she was finally well enough to leave the infirmary, the entire camp celebrated. Not just the Japanese prisoners. The American staff too, because her survival represented something larger than medicine. It represented the possibility of a different future, one not built on revenge and retribution, but on the strange and difficult work of choosing mercy when you have every right to choose otherwise. That night, Reiko lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Kenji, the 16-year-old soldier who had died in her arms, asking if the Americans were starving. She thought about her father, who had starved himself to feed his children. She thought about all the people who had died believing they were dying for something noble. And she realized that the greatest tragedy was not that they had lost. It was that they had lost for nothing. That their leaders had known it was hopeless and sent them to die anyway. That the enemy they feared had never been the monster they were told to hate. The truth was simultaneously liberating and devastating. It freed them from false beliefs, but it burdened them with the responsibility of living with that truth, of figuring out what to do with it, of deciding who to become now that everything they thought they knew had been revealed as fiction. The journey was not over. In many ways, it had only truly begun, because living with truth is harder than living with comfortable lies. And rebuilding yourself on a foundation of reality is more difficult than maintaining an identity built on propaganda. But there was no going back. They had seen too much, learned too much, changed too much. They were no longer the women who had boarded that ship in Guam. They were no longer the women who had believed the lie. They were something new, something undefined, something still forming in the crucible of revelation and mercy. And what they would become, how they would carry this truth forward, what they would do with it when they finally returned home, those questions remained unanswered. But they would have to answer them, because silence in the face of truth was its own form of lie, and they had lived under lies long enough. The truth had shattered them. Now they had to decide whether to let those broken pieces remain scattered or to rebuild themselves into something new, something honest, something whole. That decision would define the rest of their lives, and the choice was theirs alone to make. The surgery. Tomoko Fujimoto's surgery was scheduled for November 8, 1945. The day arrived cold and gray, with frost on the ground and breath visible in the morning air. She had not slept the night before, not from fear of the surgery itself. She had made peace with the possibility of death long ago. What kept her awake was the impossible strangeness of the situation. She was about to let American surgeons cut into her body to save her life. The same Americans whose country had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The same Americans she had taught her students to hate. The contradictions were making her dizzy. Reiko and Michiko accompanied her to the medical building in the pre-dawn darkness. Ayumi wanted to come too, but Tomoko had refused. "You are too young," she had said. "You do not need to see me afraid." But standing in the hallway outside the operating room, Tomoko could not hide her fear. Her hands shook. Her breathing came shallow and fast. She who had maintained discipline and composure through everything was finally completely undone. Dr. Crawford emerged in surgical scrubs, accompanied by 2 other doctors and 3 nurses. Through the interpreter, he explained the procedure again. They would remove the tumors, Use general anesthesia so she would feel nothing. The operation would take approximately 3 hours. The survival rate for this type of surgery was high. She should not worry, as if worry Webe could be turned off like a light switch. But then Dr. Crawford did something unexpected. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, the one with his son Michael and the German soldier Hans. He showed it to Tomoko. His English was slow and deliberate, giving the interpreter time to translate clearly. My son died saving an enemy. When I learned this, I was angry. I thought he wasted his life. But then I understood. He did not see enemy. He saw human being who needed help. Today, I will do same for you, not because you are prisoner, because you are human being who needs help. You understand? Tomoko nodded, unable to speak. Tears ran down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. Dr. Crawford continued, when you wake up, cancer will be gone. You will live. You will go home to Japan. You will see your family. You will have years ahead. This I promise you, not as enemy to prisoner, as doctor to patient, as human to human. He placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that transcended language and nationality. Then he and his team disappeared into the operating room to prepare. Reiko and Machiko sat on a bench in the hallway to wait. Around them, the camp was waking up. Sounds of morning routines drifted through the walls. Somewhere women were washing for breakfast. Others were beginning their work details. Life continued its mundane rhythms even while one woman's life hung in the balance. 3 hours and 17 minutes later, Dr. Crawford emerged. His scrubs were marked with blood, but his face showed satisfaction. Through the interpreter, he said simply, the surgery was successful, all tumors removed. She will need time to recover, but she will live. Reiko felt something break inside her chest. Not something painful, something that had been holding too tight for too long. She bowed deeply, the formal Japanese bow of profound gratitude. Michiko did the same. Dr. Crawford looked uncomfortable with the gesture, as if he did not deserve such thanks for simply doing his job. But he accepted it with grace and disappeared back into the operating room to monitor Tomoko's recovery. When Tomoko woke 6 hours later groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, the first thing she saw was Reiko sitting beside her bed. The first words she spoke were barely audible. I am alive. They saved me. Why would they save me? Reiko had no answer. Or rather, she had too many answers, none of them adequate to explain the profound mystery of mercy extended to an enemy. The conversation about responsibility. 2 weeks after Tomoko's surgery, as winter settled fully over Camp McCoy and the first significant snow fell, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called an assembly. Harrison was the camp's commanding officer, a man in his late 40s who had fought in the First War and now found himself managing prisoners in the Second. He stood before the assembled women and spoke through the interpreter in a tone that was neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply factual. Many of you have asked why we treat you this way, why we feed you well, why we provide medical care, why we do not punish you for the actions of your government. I want to address this directly because you deserve an honest answer. He paused to let the interpreter catch up. Under the Geneva Conventions, we are required to treat prisoners humanely. But that is not the only reason. The real reason is simpler. You are not your government. You did not start this war. Most of you did not even want this war. You were conscripted, ordered to serve, given no choice. His voice carried weight without anger. We do not hold individuals responsible for the actions of governments they could not control. That would be unjust. But we do ask you to think about something, to consider a question. He let that hang for a moment before continuing. When you return to Japan, you will have a choice. You can choose to remain silent about what you learned here, to pretend America was as you were told, to maintain the lie for comfort's sake, or you can choose to tell the truth, to tell your families, your communities, your country what you actually saw, that we were not the monsters you were promised, that we treated you with humanity even when we had no obligation to do so. He looked out across the assembled women. I am not asking you to love America. I am not asking you to forget the bombs we dropped or the war we fought. I am simply asking you to be honest about what happened here, because lies are what started this war, and only truth can prevent the next one. The hall was absolutely silent. not the silence of fear, the silence of people confronting an uncomfortable responsibility. Harrison continued, "In a few months you will be repatriated, sent home. This experience will become a memory. What you do with that memory is your choice. But remember this, truth is not comfortable. Truth does not make you popular. Truth often makes you an outcast among people who prefer comfortable lies." He paused. "But truth is the only foundation on which lasting peace can be built. And peace is worth the discomfort of truth." With that, he dismissed them. That evening, the women gathered in small groups to discuss what Harrison had said. The conversations were heated, uncertain, full of questions that had no easy answers. In one corner of the barracks, Tomoko sat with Reiko, Michiko, and Ayumi. Her surgical scar was still healing, a line across her chest that would remain visible for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of American mercy. She spoke quietly but with intensity. "He is right. We have to tell the truth. But do you understand what that means? We will be telling people that everything they believe was a lie, that their sons and husbands and fathers died for nothing, that the empire lied to them." Michiko nodded slowly. "I know. I spent 18 months broadcasting those lies. Now I have to admit I was wrong, that I helped perpetuate the deception. People will hate me for that." Ayumi, young and still idealistic despite everything said. "But if we do not tell the truth, we are still lying. We become part of the system that killed our families. My father died for a lie. I will not let his death continue to serve that lie." Reiko had been quiet, but now she spoke. "The hardest part is not telling strangers. The hardest part is telling family. My mother, my brother, they will ask me about America, about the Americans. What do I tell them?" She looked at the others. "Do I tell them that the enemy who bombed our cities also gave me medicine and saved my life? Do I tell them that the doctor whose son was killed by Germans chose to heal me, a Japanese prisoner? Do I tell them that everything we were taught about American brutality was false?" Tomoko answered. "Yes, you tell them all of that, because if you do not, you are choosing comfort over truth. And that choice is how we got into this nightmare in the first place." The photograph that explained everything. In early December, with Tomoko recovered enough to return to light duties, Dr. Crawford called Reiko into his office. She went nervously, unsure what he wanted. Her English had improved over the months of working with the medical staff, enough for simple conversations, but still far from fluent. He gestured for her to sit. On his desk lay the photograph. Michael and Hans, smiling in France. Dr. Crawford spoke slowly, choosing simple words. "I want to tell you a story about my son, about why I am here." He picked up the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. "This picture came to me after Michael died. From Hans, the German soldier. He wrote letter. Very difficult letter. He tell me what happened." Dr. Crawford's voice was steady, but his eyes showed old pain. "Michael was medic, like you nurse. His job was save lives. On battlefield, he find Hans, German soldier. Shot in stomach, dying. Michael could leave him, should leave him maybe. Enemy soldier, but Michael did not see enemy. He see human being dying." He paused, staring at the photograph. "Michael tried to save Hans, give medicine, stop bleeding. But there was shooting. Sniper. Michael was hit, died there holding bandage to Hans's wound." The silence stretched. Reiko waited, sensing there was more. Dr. Crawford continued. "Hans survived. American soldiers found them both. Hans lived because of my son. After war ended, Hans wrote to me. He tell me he was factory worker before war, did not want to fight, was conscripted, forced to serve. He had wife, baby daughter in Germany. He said Michael gave him chance to see them again. That Michael was good man who died for right reason." He looked directly at Reiko. "I was angry when I read that letter. My son dead and I supposed to be happy German, lived. I hate Hans. I hate all Germans, all Japanese, all enemies who took my boy." His voice dropped lower. "But then I think, what would Michael want? He chose to save Hans. That was his choice. He saw human, not enemy. If I hate Hans, I am saying my son was wrong, that his choice was wrong, that his death was meaningless." Dr. Crawford set the photograph down carefully. "So I come here, to camp, to do what Michael would do, save lives, all lives, even enemy lives, because that is what doctors should do. What my son believed doctors should do. He looked at Reiko with eyes that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. When you go home, you will tell people about this place. Some will not believe you. Some will say you are a traitor for saying Americans showed mercy. Some will hate you for truth. His voice became firm. But you must tell anyway, because Michael died believing humans should help each other even in war, especially in war. If you stay silent about what happened here, his death means nothing. But if you tell truth, if you help build peace with honesty, then maybe his death had meaning. Reiko felt tears sliding down her face. She understood now, fully and completely. This was not about politics or nations or war. This was about a father trying to honor his son by completing his son's work, by choosing mercy over revenge, by seeing humans instead of enemies. She bowed deeply, then said in her careful English, "I will tell. I promise, your son's choice. Your choice, I will tell everyone." Dr. Crawford nodded, satisfied. Then his professional mask returned. He picked up a medical file. "Now, back to work. Patient in room 3 needs bandages changed." The moment of profound sharing was over. They returned to the mundane work of healing. But something had shifted. Reiko now understood the weight of the responsibility she carried. She was not just a former prisoner. She was a witness, and witnesses have obligations. The hardest truth, as Christmas approached, the camp prepared for the holiday. The American staff decorated a tree in the mess hall. They played Christmas carols on the radio. They seemed determined to celebrate despite being thousands of miles from home, despite the war that had just ended, despite everything. The Japanese women watched these preparations with confusion. They did not understand Christmas, did not understand the cultural significance, but they understood the human need for ritual, for celebration, for finding joy, even in difficult circumstances. On Christmas morning, the American staff served a special meal: turkey mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, rolls pie, a feast that seemed obscene in its abundance. The women ate quietly, still unable to fully process the contrast between this and their memories of starvation in Japan. After the meal, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood to address them. His words, translated carefully, carried an unexpected weight. "Today, Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Even if you do not share this faith, you can understand the principle at its heart. The idea that love and mercy can triumph over hate and violence. That forgiveness is possible, even between enemies. That redemption is available to all who seek it honestly." He paused. "I tell you this because in a few weeks, you will begin the journey home. And you will carry with you a truth that many in Japan will not want to hear. That America was not the monster you were told. That we treated you humanely when we could have chosen revenge." His voice became more intense. "But you must also carry another truth. One that is harder to speak. Japan committed atrocities during this war. In China, in Korea, in the Philippines, in prisoner of war camps. Your government, your military did terrible things. Things that cannot be excused or forgotten." The room tensed. This was dangerous territory. Harrison continued without flinching. "I do not hold you personally responsible for those atrocities. Most of you had no knowledge of them, no power to stop them, but you must acknowledge they happened, because truth cannot be selective. You cannot tell the truth about American mercy while remaining silent about Japanese brutality. Both are true. Both must be spoken." He looked out across the assembled women. "When you go home, some will want you to be silent about American kindness, because it makes Japan look bad by comparison. Others will want you to be silent about Japanese atrocities because acknowledging them brings shame. But real peace requires acknowledging all truths, the comfortable and the uncomfortable, the merciful and the brutal." Tomoko stood slowly, her surgical scar visible at the collar of her shirt. Through the interpreter, she asked, "And if we tell these truths and are rejected? If our families, our communities, our country refuses to listen?" Harrison's answer was simple: "Then you tell them anyway." Truth does not require acceptance to remain true. You speak it because it is true, not because it is easy or popular or safe. That is the burden of being a witness. The letters home. In January 1946, as preparations for repatriation began in earnest, the women were allowed to write uncensored letters home. For the first time, they could say anything they wanted without fear of military censors blocking the content. Reiko sat with blank paper for an hour before beginning to write. How do you explain 6 months of revelation in a letter? How do you tell your family that everything they believe is a lie? Finally, she began, "Dear Mother and Kenji, I am alive and well, more than well. I am healthy for the first time in years. The Americans have treated me with care I did not expect and still struggle to understand. I need to tell you something difficult. Everything we were told about America was false. They are not weak. They are not dying. They are not cruel. Their cities are intact. Their people are healthy. They have so much food they throw it away. I know this is hard to hear. I know you will not want to believe it, but I have seen it with my own eyes. I have lived it for 6 months. The truth is undeniable. The doctor who saved my life lost his son in the war. His son was killed by Germans while trying to save a German soldier. This doctor chose to heal me, a Japanese prisoner, as a way of honoring his son's belief that doctors should heal all people, even enemies. Mother, when I return home, I will tell everyone this truth. Some will call me a traitor. Some will say I have been brainwashed. But I must speak because silence would make me complicit in the lies that killed father and so many others. Kenji, you are young enough to build a different future. One based on truth instead of propaganda. When I come home, I will tell you everything I learned. And I hope you will carry that truth forward into a Japan that can finally face reality honestly. I love you both. I will see you soon. Reiko. She folded the letter and sealed it before she could second-guess herself. Around her, other women were writing similar letters. Confession, revelation, warning, preparation for a homecoming that would be more complicated than any of them wanted to admit. Michiko wrote to her mother about the radio broadcasts, about the lies she had told, about the truth she had learned. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply stated facts and accepted responsibility. Ayumi wrote to her aunt about her father's death, about learning that he had died for a lie, about her determination to ensure his death would not continue to serve that lie by speaking truth no matter the cost. Tomoko wrote to former students, now adults, some of whom had lost family in the war. She admitted she had taught them falsehoods. She acknowledged her role in perpetuating the system of lies. She asked not for forgiveness but for understanding as she tried to make amends by telling the truth now. The letters were posted. The women waited for responses with a mixture of hope and dread. The responses when they came weeks later were mixed and painful. Some family members wrote back with anger. You have betrayed your country. You have been corrupted by the enemy. Do not come home speaking such lies. We do not want to hear them. Others wrote with confusion. We do not understand what you are saying. Of course the Americans were weak. We were told this by the government, by the newspapers, by the emperor himself. How can all of that be false? A few wrote with quiet acknowledgement. We suspected. During the occupation, the American soldiers have been kind. They feed us. They do not hurt us. We did not want to believe it because it meant everything we sacrificed was for nothing. But perhaps it is time to face the truth. Reiko's mother wrote a letter that Reiko read 3 times each time, finding new layers of pain and understanding. My daughter, I believe you because I see the truth here. The Americans who occupy our city are not monsters. They are men, boys really. Some of them show me pictures of their families. Some of them help old women carry heavy loads. Some of them give chocolate to children. I did not want to see this. I wanted to hate them because hatred is easier than acknowledging we were wrong. But I cannot hate people who are feeding my son, who are helping him grow tall and strong for the first time in his life. Your father died believing the lie. That is my grief to carry. But you and Kenji will live knowing the truth. That is my hope to hold. Come home when you can. We will face this new world together. The letter broke something in Reiko and rebuilt it simultaneously. Her mother understood. Her mother believed her. They would face the truth together. Not everyone would be so fortunate. Some of the women received letters disowning them, calling them traitors, forbidding them from returning home. The price of truth was higher than they wanted to pay, but necessary nonetheless. The final assembly. In late March 1946, with cherry blossoms blooming in Japan, though winter still held Wisconsin, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called a final assembly. The repatriation ships were ready. Within days, the women would begin the journey home. Harrison stood before them one last time. His voice carried the weight of finality. In a few days, you will leave this camp. You will board ships that will take you back to Japan, back to your families, back to your lives. What you do with what you learned here is your choice. But I want to leave you with one final thought. He paused, gathering his words carefully. The war is over. Japan lost. Those are facts. But defeat does not have to mean destruction. Germany was defeated in the First War and became bitter and vengeful. That bitterness led to the Second War. That path leads only to more death. But there is another path, the path of honest self-examination, of acknowledging mistakes and learning from them, of building something new on a foundation of truth instead of maintaining something old on a foundation of lies. His voice became more intense. You have seen that Americans are human. Flawed, certainly. We have our own sins to answer for. But human, capable of mercy, capable of choosing healing over revenge. If we can do that, so can you. So can Japan. He looked across the assembled women. When you go home, you will be tempted to forget what happened here, to dismiss it as an exception, to return to comfortable lies that let you feel superior or victimized or whatever allows you to avoid the hard work of truth. Do not give in to that temptation. Remember the food you were given. Remember the medicine. Remember Dr. Crawford, who healed you, though his son died in the war. Remember all of it, and use those memories to build something better than what came before. Tomoko stood, her surgical scar visible. Through the interpreter, she asked, "And if we are rejected?" If Japan is not ready to hear these truths, Harrison's answer was firm. Then you plant seeds. You tell your children. You tell your grandchildren. You create small circles of truth that will grow over time. Change does not happen instantly. It happens through the patient work of honest people refusing to accept lies. He smiled slightly. You are those honest people now, whether you wanted to be or not. That is the burden and the privilege of being witnesses to something true. The departure, the morning of April 15th, 1946, was clear and cold. The women assembled in the camp courtyard with their few belongings. They wore the same uniforms they had arrived in, now clean and repaired. They carried bags with personal items, letters from home, and the memories of 6 months that had changed everything. The American staff lined up to see them off. Doctors, nurses, guards, kitchen staff, people who had spent months caring for women they had every reason to hate, people who had chosen differently. Dr. Crawford approached Reiko. He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, she found a medical textbook in English and a note in simple, careful writing. You are a good nurse. You can be good doctor too. Study, learn, use medicine to heal. Like my son, like me. Build peace one patient at a time. Reiko bowed deeply, clutching the book to her chest. She tried to speak, but could not find words adequate to the moment. Dr. Crawford simply nodded. He understood. Throughout the courtyard, similar scenes played out. Small gifts, brief embraces, moments of connection between people who should have been enemies, but had chosen to be something else. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made brief remarks. You are no longer prisoners. You are witnesses. Do not forget what you witnessed. Do not let anyone convince you it did not happen. Tell the truth even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. The women boarded buses that would take them to trains that would take them to ships. As the buses pulled away from Camp McCoy, Reiko looked back at the place that had shattered her worldview and rebuilt it on truth. She thought about the meal on the ship that first revealed the lie, about the soap and hot water that restored her dignity, about the medicine that saved her life, about Dr. Crawford and his son Michael, and the choice to heal instead of hate. She thought about going home and telling these stories to people who would not want to hear them, about the difficulty ahead, about the rejection and anger and accusations of betrayal. But she also thought about her mother's letter, about Kenji growing tall on American food, about the possibility of building something new instead of maintaining something broken. The promise on the ship home as the American coastline disappeared behind them, and the vast Pacific stretched ahead, the 300 women gathered on deck. They had been through something together, something that had changed them fundamentally. They needed to acknowledge it, to make it real, to commit to carrying it forward. Tomoko recovered from her surgery and stronger than she had been in years spoke first. When we arrive in Japan, we will scatter to our homes, to our families, to our lives. We may never see each other again, but we must promise each other something before we part. She looked around at the assembled women. We must promise to tell the truth, all of it, the uncomfortable parts and the merciful parts, the parts that make Japan look bad and the parts that make America look good. All of it, because selective truth is just another form of lie, Machiko added. I spent 18 months broadcasting lies. I know how easy it is to shade the truth, to emphasize some facts and hide others, to create a narrative that serves your purpose instead of serving reality. We cannot do that. We must tell everything even when it hurts us, especially when it hurts us. Ayumi, still young but no longer naive, spoke with quiet intensity. My father died for a lie. If I stay silent about that, his death continues to serve the lie. But if I tell the truth, maybe his death can serve something better. Truth, understanding, peace built on reality instead of propaganda. Reiko was the last to speak. The Americans showed us mercy when they had every reason for revenge. Dr. Crawford saved my life, though his son died in the war. That mercy demands a response. Not gratitude exactly. Something deeper. The responsibility to use what we learned to build something better. She paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. I promised to tell the truth about what happened at Camp McCoy. To tell my family, my community, my country. Even if they hate me for it. Even if they call me a traitor. Even if I am rejected and alone. Because truth is the only foundation for peace. And I want peace more than I want comfort. One by one, the women made the same promise. 300 voices speaking commitment into the wind. It was not a legal contract. There was no enforcement mechanism. It was simply a choice, a collective decision to serve truth instead of self-interest. The ship plowed eastward through gray waters. Ahead lay Japan, home, family. The familiar made strange by knowledge. The comfortable made uncomfortable by truth. The past that could never be recovered. The future that had to be built on honest foundations. They did not know what awaited them. Acceptance or rejection. Understanding or anger. Welcome or exile. But they knew what they carried. Truth. Witnessed and undeniable. And the determination to speak it regardless of cost. As the sun set behind them and darkness covered the Pacific, Reiko stood at the railing with Machiko and Ayumi. 3 women who had boarded a ship expecting death and found instead something more complicated and more valuable. Knowledge, truth, the responsibility of being witnesses to mercy when mercy was unexpected. Tomorrow they would be one day closer to home, to the accounting that awaited, to the hard work of building peace through uncomfortable honesty, to living with truth when lies were easier. But tonight they were together, 300 women who had seen the same thing, who carried the same knowledge, who bore the same responsibility. And that shared experience, that collective witness, gave them strength for what was ahead. The stars came out, the ship sailed on, and in the darkness, 300 women carried light, not the blinding light of propaganda, the quieter, harder light of truth. The kind of light that does not reveal easy answers, but illuminates the path toward better questions. That would have to be enough, because it was all they had. And sometimes when everything else has been taken away, truth is the only weapon worth wielding, the only foundation worth building on, the only legacy worth leaving. They would tell their children. Those children would tell their grandchildren. The truth would spread, slowly, painfully, against resistance, but inexorably, because truth once witnessed cannot be completely suppressed. It finds cracks, it grows, it persists, and perhaps decades in the future someone would look back and see this moment, this voyage, these women, and understand that peace is not built by governments or treaties alone. It is built by ordinary people choosing to speak uncomfortable truths, choosing mercy over revenge, choosing understanding over comfortable lies. That was the real victory, not military, not political, human. The victory of truth over propaganda, of mercy over hate, of the patient, difficult work of building peace one honest conversation at a time. The ship sailed on through the darkness, carrying its cargo of witnesses home, to speak, to testify, build, to plant seeds that would grow in soil made fertile by the ruins of a shattered lie. And that ultimately was the story of Camp McCoy. Not a story of imprisonment, but of liberation. Not a story of enemies, but of humans. Not a story of war, but of the possibility of peace. Built not on convenient fiction, but on difficult, uncomfortable, undeniable truth. The women of Camp McCoy went home carrying that truth. And though the journey was hard and the reception uncertain, they spoke it anyway. Because witnesses have obligations. And truth once seen cannot be unseen, cannot be unspoken, cannot be denied. They had seen, they would speak, and in speaking they would help build something better than what came before. That was their promise, their burden, their gift. And it began with a meal, on a ship, in August 1945, when 300 women learned that everything they believed was a lie, and chose in the end to build their lives on truth instead.